second. Yeah, you were good.
Okay. So Terry, you're ready for me to jump right in, people? And I apologize again for the long delay. And let's get started. It's such an important topic, and I want you to know I spent probably about 40 hours thinking about this question that we've posed, which are about the likely costs and consequences of the budget cuts pursued by this newly created Department of Government Efficiency. And kind of as an interesting joke as we start, it might be an interesting acronym. I'll let you decide that after you hear my presentation, but DOGE, the whole process actually feels a little bit dodgy to me. And again, I will try to share a lot of information, and you can make up your mind about that. And then I will be sharing a few numbers with you throughout about the budget. But I want you to keep in mind just one important equation, and I'm going to come to this at the very, very end of my presentation. And that's just the simple one that 2 + 2 = 4. So those are the numbers I want you to remember in the beginning. 2 + 2 = 4. All right, so let's start. First, a little basic background. What Donald Trump and the mega influencers call the deep state is really, in fact, a civil service administrative state that is critical to the reasonable, smooth functioning of a very complex democratic government and society. So that's just even the name that we use is really important. Deep state versus administrative state. Also background, there are approximately 3 million federal workers that carry out critical functions on behalf of the US government agencies and departments that are funded through yearly appropriations of Congress, that's the discretionary part of the budget, or mandatory spending. And that includes things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, out of that 3 million, very importantly, only about 4,000 federal workers are actually political appointees. All others are civic workers who carry out functions within agencies and departments based on their training and their expertise, rather than political ties or affiliation. This system is designed to reward skills and expertise in order to efficiently carry out necessary functions while minimizing corrupting political patronage, which imperils democracy and which lies at the heart of many failed dictatorships and authoritarian systems. So with that little bit of background, I'm actually very disturbed about both the process of this Department of Government Efficiency, how they are going to go about doing their work from what we know, and also the likely outcomes of their work. So apparently the process is something like this, that 1 or 2 billionaires, Republican donors, or Trump loyalists are going to be embedded in each of many federal government agencies. They will be empowered to determine what cuts to make, the extent of those cuts, and which federal workers are to be retained or dismissed based on their loyalty to the president. So both the process and the results, I think, are intended to shift US governance away from representative democracy towards authoritarianism, involving dramatic increases in presidential power and corporate influence. As President Biden noted in his farewell address last night, quote, "An oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy." Now, I want to talk a little bit about promises and motivation of this new department. President-elect Trump and Elon Musk have promised dramatic cuts in federal spending based on the recommendations of this new Department of Government Efficiency. Commonly talked about is $2 trillion a year, or $1 trillion a year. Sometimes you hear $500 billion a year. It's a lot. Now, the Department of Government Efficiency, and this is really, really important, has actually no power to implement its recommendations, which require congressional approval. This means that just a few Republican members of the House and Senate could impede both this rise of authoritarianism and what are likely to be, and I'll talk about this later, pretty disastrous consequences of proposed budget cuts that I'll describe below. Unfortunately, congressional approval is likely. Now, I see 4 possible motivations or justifications that are given for dramatically cutting federal spending, the federal budget. 1, concern that the national debt will rise without massive cuts to government programs. A second is belief that the federal government just shouldn't be funding program X, Y, or Z. You can fill in the blank. Third, belief that massive budget cuts are needed to offset the costs of equally massive tax breaks for the wealthy. Now, I'm going to mention that one again. The third possibility is belief that the massive budget cuts are needed in order to offset the costs of equally massive tax breaks for the wealthy. And a fourth possibility is belief that the federal departments and agencies, they could do their mission and fulfill their mission with far fewer funds. Now, there are lots of obstacles. Whatever the motivation, there are enormous obstacles to making massive cuts in federal spending. And if they are made by the incoming administration, the likely consequences are going to be far more painful for common citizens. You were talking about that, Aric, a little bit, common farmers, for example. But including Trump's mega base, it's going to be a lot more pain for them than for the billionaire class that is proposing these massive cuts. Now, to understand what's going on, we need to know the difference between the federal budget spending that is discretionary and that which is mandatory. So just a few words, hang in there with me. The discretionary portion of the federal budget is approved every year by Congress. It has to be authorized by Congress. I'll talk more about it in a minute. The mandatory portion of the federal budget consists of items that simply must be paid year after year. And they include things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. For simplicity's sake, I am including interest on the national debt as part of the mandatory budget because it must be paid. And I'm going to use the 2023 federal budget as an example to talk about many of the issues as we go forward. So here's where some numbers are going to come up. Now, I will tell Terry and others who have organized this event that if you want, I am happy to send out a copy of my remarks, which will have numbers in them. And I don't have a lot of numbers, but I have some. So try to hang in there with me. The total U.S. federal budget in 2023 was $6.2 trillion. Now, of that budget of $6.2 trillion, the mandatory portion, the portion that simply has to be paid, which, and again, I'm including interest on the debt, was $4.5 trillion. So $4.5 trillion out of the total budget of $6.2 trillion are mandatory things that the government has to pay for. All right. The discretionary portion of the federal budget was $1.7 trillion. So you got a total of 6.2, 4.5 of which is mandatory, 1.7 of which is discretionary, means it's controlled by the Congress controls those purse strings. Now, coincidentally, the fiscal deficit, the budget deficit for the 2023 federal budget was also $1.7 trillion. And that money then had to be borrowed in order to meet that $6.2 trillion budget and to pay mandatory expenditures plus the 1.7 discretionary budget. In order to do that, $1.7 trillion had to be added to the national debt. Okay, I hope you're with me so far. Now, the first thing I'd like to say is that it is virtually impossible for the huge cuts in federal spending promised by the Department of Government Efficiency, at least what we've heard, it's impossible to come from the discretionary budget. Now, here's why. According to the Office of the Management and Budget in 2023, military spending plus veterans benefits totaled more than $1 trillion of the discretionary budget. So $1 trillion of that $1.7 trillion that funds almost all aspects of government as we think about them is the military budget and veterans benefits, $1 trillion out of the $1.7 trillion. If we include the costs of Homeland Security and federal law enforcement, veterans benefits, we add that in along with military spending, 62% of the federal discretionary budget was spending on those four things in 2023. Now, what the Trump administration is promising to increase military spending, and there is absolutely no evidence that it is even thinking about cuts to Homeland Security or federal law enforcement. Now, the only thing that they have considered cutting is the veterans, for veterans. And I'll just say a little bit of a word about that now. Doug Collins, Trump's pick to serve as the next Veteran Administration Secretary, supports privatization of veterans' health care, which would dramatically raise the costs of health care. Pete Hegseth, his choice for the Secretary of Defense, wants to significantly cut health benefits for service members and veterans, who he says are asking for way too much. Now, veterans will be hurt by these benefit cuts, but the savings that come from those cuts are relatively minor in light of the cuts that are being sought. So one needs to ask a very simple question. And the question is, if military spending, which accounts for more than half of the discretionary budget, is off the table and in fact going to rise, and the other three items that make up the rest of that 62% of the discretionary budget hold no promise for making deep cuts that are being promised by the Department of Government Efficiency, then where is $2 trillion or $1 trillion a year going to come from out of the remaining 38% of the discretionary budget that totals somewhere between about $600 and $700 billion? How do you squeeze $1 trillion or $2 trillion out of a discretionary budget when the answer is that you simply can't? Now, before telling you where I think the money is likely to come from to achieve massive federal budget cuts, let me briefly make a case for the importance of the administrative state, while further illustrating just how unrealistic and damaging severe cuts to the non-military portion of the discretionary budget would be to the quality of life in the United States. Now, I'm going to just rattle off the names of 25 government agencies. All right, I want you to listen to them because some of them will be familiar to you, but I just chosen 25. There's many more. But think about these 25 agencies. All are involved in federal work that I think is important work. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Government Accounting Office, the Export-Import Bank, Federal Trade Commission, National Archives, Commodity Futures Trading Commission, National Endowment of the Arts, National Endowment of the Humanities, Department of Labor, Patient-Centered Outcomes Research, National Labor Relations Board, National Transportation Safety Board, Peace Corps, Federal Elections Commission, National Council on Disabilities, Consumer Product Safety Commission, Interagency Council on Homelessness, Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board, Occupational Safety and Health Department, Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board, Equal Employment Opportunity, Maritime Commission, and the National Credit Union Administration. So those are 25. And I think that these just is a sampling of agencies that we take for granted that play important roles in making our lives better and making government function. Now, here's the kicker. Eliminating all 25 of these agencies that I just named would cut the discretionary budget by 1/4%. I'm going to repeat that cutting everything out of those 25 agencies would reduce the discretionary budget by 1/4%. Now, let me continue just for a minute to illustrate the limitations of a slash and burn approach to the federal budget cutbacks that are being talked about to the discretionary budget. If we were to cut the Department of Transportation, the Department of Education, which is being seriously talked about, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture, Aric, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Environmental Protection, the State Department. Eliminating all of those federal programs would eliminate or reduce the discretionary budget only by about 13%. All of it coming from that 30% of the discretionary budget that is non-military based. All right. Now, the Department of Government Efficiency can and probably will do a lot of damage by pursuing cuts to many essential government agencies and departments, including some that I've listed above and talked about, as well as many others that I haven't named. It's also likely, and this is something I hope Aric might be able to talk about, Senator Putnam, is it's also likely that eventual Trump administration will politicize federal aid to states, cities, and counties, and with a desire to hurt blue states and blue cities within red states. Now, I have some figures on how much Minnesota receives in federal funding that I think I could look at later. Now, there are likely to be many cuts that actually save little money but cause massive harm. Cuts to the Internal Revenue Service, the Center for Disease Control, Public Health and Pandemic Preparedness, International Family Planning. The U.S., according to the Trump administration, is going to cut U.S. participation in the World Health Organization and pull out of all international climate agreements. These and many other, what I call microaggressions, will cause significant damage. But the real money that the Department of Government Efficiency needs for massive budget cuts lies elsewhere. So now we get to truth and consequences. So what's going on? Where does this lead us? So, two things to keep in mind in order to better understand the where of budget cuts and the why of massive budget cuts. First, the primary policy goal of Trump's administration, past and present, was and is to retain or expand tax breaks for wealthy Americans. In other words, raising tax revenue through a fairer tax system, including taxing the wealthy, is off the table as a means to fund essential federal programs and to reduce or even stabilize the nation's debt. In the past, funding tax breaks for the wealthy have involved cuts to programs that help the poor, but they were largely paid for or achieved by driving up the national debt. The preference now seems to be to have massive federal budget cuts offset equally massive tax cuts for the wealthy. Hence the need for the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. Now, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed in 2017, which President Trump and his supporters regard as his greatest single achievement, will expire if not renewed by Congress in 2025. As the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities noted, the tax law was, quote, skewed in favor of the rich, end quote, with the top 1% receiving an average tax cut of $60,000 in 2025, while households in the bottom 60% received less than $500. $60,000 for the wealthiest Americans, less than $500 for the bottom 60% of households. According to the Congressional Budget Office, making that law's temporary individual income and estate tax provisions permanent will cost the federal government $400 million a year beginning in 2027. The law, quote, has severely eroded our country's revenue base, end quote. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget estimates that extending all these provisions, which is the #1 priority of this administration, would add more than $5 trillion to the deficit through year 2035. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind to help us understand the where of massive budget cuts is that cuts to Social Security and Medicare, according to Trump, are off the table. I'm going to say that again. I think there are many Republicans who would like to mess with Social Security. But President Trump has come out recently again and said that cutting Social Security and Medicare are off the table. The reason is simple. They would fuel a massive political backlash. Now, you can weaken Social Security by raising the retirement age, which victimizes working class Americans that don't live as long. And you can inadequately fund it by refusing to raise the income threshold for payment into the system. But direct attacks against these popular programs, at least for now, are deemed unwise, politically unwise. Similarly, you can cede additional influence and many profits to private health insurance companies, but a direct attack on Medicare is equally politically fraught. So where are the major federal government funding cuts going to come from? And who's likely to bear the brunt of those cuts? Now, I've mentioned before, Medicare and Social Security are part of the mandatory federal budget, but they are apparently off the table. But I also mentioned another program that is part of this mandatory spending part of the federal budget. That is Medicaid. Medicaid is not off the table. And there are two reasons Medicaid is on the table. First, it's a big pot of federal money. The cost in 2003 for the federal government was $871 billion. $871 billion for Medicaid across all 50 states. Now, the federal government currently funds 100% of the cost of Medicaid for the states, other than cost sharing for a state's administration of the program. So one reason Medicaid is on the chopping block is because it's a big pot of money. The second reason, and maybe it's the more important reason, well, as important, Medicaid serves vulnerable constituencies with limited political clout. Medicaid, along with the Children's Health Insurance Program, serves around 79 million low-income individuals, including children, pregnant women, elderly people, and those with disabilities. Republicans are looking to add onerous work requirements to Medicaid, transition to block grants, impose spending caps, shift more financial responsibility onto the states, and overall make financial cuts, drastic financial cuts to the program. Cuts are estimated to exceed $2 trillion or more over the next 10 years. The other prime target for spending cuts is, maybe you guessed it, the Affordable Care Act. Republican lawmakers have no health care plans of their own. but they want to change how the Affordable Care Act operates. They want to introduce high-risk participant pools and reduce subsidies for public health exchanges in order to discourage enrollment. Enhanced Affordable Care Act premium subsidies enacted during the Biden administration are set to expire at the end of 2025, which means the Republicans can make major cuts by doing nothing. As a result, Affordable Care Act enrollees will see out-of-pocket premiums increase by an average of more than $700 a year, or 79%. Enrollment in the ACA nearly doubled to a record 21 million after the enhanced subsidies went into effect. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that 6.9 million fewer people would be enrolled without these subsidies, and 3.4 million would be added to the uninsured population. Now, the federal government would save some money, about $350 billion over a decade, if they can gut the ACA. But the human and health costs for individuals and families would be enormous. So I'm winding down here, but I want to talk a little bit about the challenges ahead and maybe some alternatives. Massive budget cuts, as well as many of what I call the microaggressions, will hurt a lot of people, including a large portion of those who voted for President Trump. This, however, is only part of a much, much larger problem. Other Trump administration policies will be even more problematic. Mass deportation of undocumented persons will cause enormous human suffering, fuel inflation, cripple agriculture, decimate senior care centers, and dramatically increase housing costs. Soaring inequalities and likely rising federal debt would put further strain on Social Security and Medicare. Undermining the Affordable Care Act without any meaningful healthcare reforms will make many Americans sicker and poorer. Increased military spending will further militarize spending priorities within the discretionary budget. Undermining climate change initiatives in favor of a drill baby drill policy will mean more damaging floods, droughts, hurricanes, sea level rise, and wildfires. The collective weight of these policies could and probably will be catastrophic. I encountered a word recently in the Minnesota Star Tribune that I think perfectly encapsulates our present dilemmas. The word is caucustocracy. Caucustocracy, defined by the American Heritage Dictionary as government by the least qualified or most unprincipled citizens, or government by the worst men, or government under the control of a nation's worst or least qualified citizens. Caucustocracy, I think, is where we are today. And what makes our dilemma more perilous is that while the plans and policies I've described above will have disastrous consequences for individuals and the nation, they are being carried out at the same time as a legal edifice of authoritarianism is being constructed under the cover of the whims and wishes of a feigned populism that will fail to address legitimate needs and grievances. A man named Ivo Dodler, chief officer of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, writes that his major concern, and I would share it, his major concern, quote, is not that liberalism has lost its ability to offer solutions, but that populism's failures will lead to repressive consequences by the very strong men who rode the populist waves to power. I'm going to repeat that and then summarize its meaning. So his greatest concern, he says, is not that liberalism has lost its ability to offer solutions, but that populism's failures will lead to repressive consequences by the very strong men who rolled the populist waves to power. In other words, a grave danger is that as things unravel, which I think they are likely to do, the architects of the unraveling will find ways to blame others for their failures and exploit them to further enhance their abusive powers. I close with two quotes from Albert Camus' book, The Plague. Camus wrote in the midst of a plague, he says, "Here, but again and again, there comes a time in history when the person who dares to say that 2 and 2 make 4 is punished with death. The school teacher is aware of this," he writes. "And the question is not one of knowing what punishments or rewards attends the making of this calculation. The question is one of knowing whether 2 and 2 do make 4. Now, and somewhat in jest, and somewhat I wonder if it actually symbolically it might be interesting. Is perhaps it's time to start an alternative movement to the MAGA movement. And I would base it on Camus and say, call it the 2 + 2 = 4 movement. Because that's an obvious number. When President Trump and Republican senators and congresspersons appoint or try to appoint some of the least qualifiable people imaginable to federal positions, like Pete Hegseth to be defense secretary and Robert Kennedy Jr. to head the Department of Health and Human Services, we should create a national outcome and say 2 + 2 = 4. In other words, the reality of what's going on is so clear here that you have to be complicit in horrific ways to allow it to go on. When they claim tax cuts to the wealthy pay for themselves, it's another 2 + 2 = 4 moment. When they threaten Canada and Mexico and Greenland militarily, it's another time to be clear that 2 + 2, in fact, does equal 4. The same holds when the President of the United States and a willing Republican Senate and Congress turn the FBI and the Department of Justice into instruments of vengeance against political foes, or when they cut the IRS and give billions of dollars of tax breaks to the billionaires and say with a straight face that they are concerned about the national debt, or that they care about inflation and the cost of eggs while pursuing inflationary policies and those that will throw many farmers under the bus. 2 + 2 does equal 4. Or when they are champions of common people while funding tax breaks for the wealthy with cuts to healthcare and Medicaid, we need to say 2 + 2 actually equals 4. Now, Camus also wrote the other quote. He said in The Plague, he says, "I have no idea what's awaiting me or us, or what will happen when this all ends. For the moment, I know this. There are 6 sick people and they need curing," end quote. Or I might say, or paraphrase instead, there are some pretty sick people running our government, and many of them are so far off the edge in their support of a dangerous con man that they no longer know that 2 + 2 = 4. They need to be stopped. Or I don't know what exactly awaits us or what will happen when all this ends. For the moment, I know this. There are and will be many people hurting who need our support and protection, need our vision and practical ideas for real solutions to real problems, and our determination to build a fairer, more just, and sustainable nation. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thanks a ton, Jack. That was thoughtful, well researched, obviously very clear. I did jot down a couple things for us to talk about on the idea level, but first we have a math question. So maybe we can do the math question first. And that's from Bill. Bill asks, how is it that eliminating all 25 agencies in the discretionary budget, 38%, would only reduce the budget by 0.25%?
The answer is, if you can go onto government websites and it will tell you, and I'm going to go back up to my own notes here, and it'll tell you what percent of the discretionary budget is involved with each of those programs. And the ones that I first lifted up, those 25, all came in on 1% of the discretionary budget or less. So you take 25 of those that are less than that are 1%, and that adds up to 0.25%. Now, there's going to be more damage in some of the other ones. For example, and this is still not a lot, but it's important. The work that is important. You want a Department of Transportation that functions. Well, cutting that would actually be about 2% of the discretionary budget. Energy would be 1.2%. Agriculture would be 3.4%. The Federal Insurance Corporation would be 1.2%, et cetera, et cetera. So you can go on government websites and look up these agencies, and it will tell you the percentage of money that is in the budget that goes for them. And that's how I found those figures.
Thanks for that, Jack. Now, we have a couple other comments and questions in the Q&A zone, but I think it might be interesting and spur some more questions and some more conversations if we get a little bit more abstract, perhaps. So my question for you is, why did people vote for this crap?
Yes. Okay. And this would be another, I think, really important conversation to have. So I'm going to say just a number of responses, and we'll see if that prompts other people's questions as well. One is that a politics of fear almost always works. And so if you look at the Democrats essentially ran a campaign, I think you heard a lot of the word joy and hope and possibility, and we're in it together. But fear worked. If you look at the ads that dominated the airwaves nationally, well, especially in the targeted states, the really important states, it was the ad about Kamala Harris supporting to federal paying of prisoners transitioning to a different sex. To my knowledge, you know how many there were in the nation? How many of these surgeries took place? 2 in the history. And yet that was the dominant ad that went on. Another very effective Republican ad in the swing states was, and I actually share some of this concern. It was saying the Democrats are for they and them. Donald Trump is for you. Now, I remember Nicholas Kristof, a New York Times writer who I actually like. I don't know if he lives in Oregon, but he said at one point, he had an article that said that a lot of people who voted believe the Democrats were more interested in pronouns than they were on inflation and housing. Now, whether that is true or not true, it's a partial answer. It's the cultural question. The focus on transgender athletes, which I think there's some really valid questions about some of those things. But so that's rambling answer to a shorter answer is to say that a lot of the factor is fear. A lot of the factors is misinformation that is repeated over and over. And some of the factors are related to the failings of the Democratic Party itself. That have not responded to policies in urban centers that really encourage the production of low-income housing, for example. And then another issue that I'm just going to mention here because of who sponsored this event is we have a very big problem in that when you look at that military portion of the discretionary budget, that is always a bipartisan reality. There's very little possibility of transitioning to a sustainable world and society unless we help that world, including our own nation, transition away from war preparation and war towards an international order that takes these problems seriously. So I'll stop there.
No, I really appreciate that. And I think that your answer actually kind of wraps together some of the other stuff you were talking about too, because politics isn't really a math problem. It's much more aesthetic. And fascism itself isn't aesthetic. Sometimes people think that the rise to fascism is exclusively because of a sort of material deprivation, but it's also because of a feeling and a kind of argument that I think that you're really tapping into in your conversation. And that also leads to another kind of question that's close to something that our pal Rose, my dear pal Rose, is on the call. And she asked a question about interaction with state governments. So one of the arguments that Trump made that wasn't perhaps as clearly, obviously awful as some of his other arguments was that, well, the federal government's too big. The state government can take care of all these things. And here's one specific example right now that we're dealing with that you all should know about. The federal government, the USDA, splits with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture the cost of inspecting meat. So the meat inspection in the state of Minnesota costs around $5 million a year. The federal government splits that 50-50 with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. We are hearing, I was in a meeting this morning with the governor and the commissioner, that the federal government's going to pull that back. So the state is going to have to come up with another $2.5 million just to make sure that our meat is inspected. Suggested kind of by Rose's question and by their larger argument, why don't the states take care of more of these problems? But why isn't that going to work? I don't think you can hear my sarcasm, but I'm trying to be open-minded.
Right.
What are we going to do, Jack?
Well, it imposes incredible burdens onto the states to make those changes, and it's what I was trying to get at with the Republican strategy of going after Medicaid and trying to shift it to the states. And there are still states that have refused to even do Medicaid because they didn't want to even pick up the cost of administering it as a state. So the idea that we're just going to shift all the burden onto states, I mean, you could make a parallel to thinking about if we don't have a fair tax system in other ways, you usually end up with then you have to assess taxes on something, so property taxes go up. So I mean, there are certainly things that we can do as a state, and in fact, we're going to have to do them better as a state under the federal leadership that we're going to have. But to think that that is an easy fix on its own, it's going to raise a lot of the same questions about what is our tax base. And I personally believe that the United States desperately needs a wealth tax. Now, one of the things that isn't talked about very much related to Social Security is one of the major things that is leading to Social Security facing problems in the next decade is the inequality that has widened in the past 30 years. Because when income gets concentrated and you're only paying a certain amount of into Social Security up to a certain level of income, the more income is concentrated, the less money is going into Social Security. So it's just another example that you can't just pawn this off on the states. And as a state, we're going to have to make really compelling arguments about how are we going to fund the things that really matter in people's lives in light of, I think, some of what's coming. And that may mean, I for one, would be happy to pay more taxes if we are targeting those taxes towards things that really matter. And I think the Democrats tried to do that the last time around, but I think we're going to run into, or you're going to run into some fiscal cliffs if we don't have continue to have changes in the tax system that allow us to meet what are going to be more pressing needs as a result of federal policies.
You know, your conversation, your discussion of the effects of some of these changes is profound and disturbing. One of the things I think of in the back of my head is these civil service jobs, and I very much appreciate you characterizing them as such. Those are good jobs, aren't they?
Yes.
What do we do with the people who are laid off if the Department of Education disappears? Where do they go for jobs? Has this happened in the past? Do you have any sort of context for what are we going to do with all these people who are looking for jobs who used to work for the government?
Maybe they'll want to work in senior citizen centers, earning $15 an hour. Maybe we can get them to do that. Maybe they can go up on my roof and replace my roof. And I'm sure they're going to be eager to do that. So I'm being sarcastic here to say that there is no good answer to that. But I think an implication of what you're saying is that if you cause enormous pain through the gutting of those civil service jobs, that is going to have an economic impact and a tax implication as well. And it's not going to be pretty. It's going to aggravate many of the problems.
You know, we have a number of questions and comments that are about kind of what we can do next, how we should do politics differently to make sure that this doesn't happen again, and to protect ourselves in the moment now. That's a very general question. There's sub questions to that too, but do you have any sort of initial feelings on protecting us from what we got looking at and doing something better next time?
Yeah, I do, and none of them are great or complete or going to save us. But here's some of my thoughts. One is, I think we have to be particularly mindful of being in touch with people in sectors that are going to be dramatically impacted. And some of them that come to mind, I think the farm community is going to be a really important one. I remember there was an article in the Minnesota Trib written by a dairy farmer in Wisconsin. I think that said that 90% of dairy farmers in Wisconsin had to hire undocumented workers because there weren't anybody to take those jobs. And he believed that a huge percentage of dairy farms in Wisconsin will go under if those threats. So that's a sector in agriculture. Another sector is the immigrant population itself. Just living with the fear and the stress and the tension of deportation. And it's going to be a wide net, probably. So I think we need a better immigration system, but we can't use or treat people as less than human beings because we have failed to put together a reasonable immigration system that is doable. So that's another sector and another problem. I think to make common sense suggestions on improving certain things. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. One would be, we hear a lot about Social Security being in trouble, but a relatively simple fix is to raise the income threshold. And doing that would be much fairer, much more effective than raising the retirement age, which again penalized. My father died of cancer at the age of 59. He was a working class printer who breathed chemicals in the workplace and never collected a penny of Social Security. When we raise the retirement age in a racist and unequal society, it is harmful to the people who oftentimes are most in need of it. So that talking about kind of common sense things like that. Also, I believe that the Pentagon has never, I know in the last 7 years and probably closer to the last 40, I don't think has ever passed an audit. It doesn't even know where its money is going. we're scheduled to spend $1 trillion or $2 trillion over the next 30 years to upgrade nuclear weapons arsenal. Well, is that what we really want to be doing? So, raising some of those issues and putting real numbers on them compared to things that are being cut, that's another. And then I do think it's important, especially for Democrats, that we recognize that the language we use isn't always as important as we think it is. For example, most people who are coming from Spanish-speaking countries, they don't refer to themselves as Latinx. Most people of color in different communities of color in the United States don't refer to themselves as BIPOC. Most people, and I would always be respectful of students that I taught who preferred a certain pronoun or another. But I think we reached a point where oftentimes we would divide people and constituencies that should be working together for a common future around things like housing and food quality and sustainable agricultural system, addressing climate change and creating good paying jobs and addressing inequality and shoring up Social Security, all those kinds of things. There's a huge percentage of the population, including among those that voted for Donald Trump, that would benefit from policies like that. And I think we have to find ways of talking to each other that deal with some of the cultural factors as well as some of the practical ones.
No, I like that. I think that's really smart. And I appreciate your discussion of some protective policies and some kind of like practical things we might do in terms of politics. Do you think that we need to do, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think that especially those of us who might self-identify as progressives to a certain extent, sometimes we use the exact same vocabulary of identity and the same politics of domination that the conservatives do. We just use it in a different way.
Yeah.
But we're still using very static understandings of identity and ones that aren't really productive or as progressive as we're trying to be. But that being said, do you think that, do you have ideas for how we might motivate some populations that have felt kind of alienated by some of our efforts in the past, or not alienated, maybe that's not fair, but at least not included?
Yeah.
And specifically when you talk about farmers and immigrants, those were two populations that I think people like you and I struggled with in this past election. So how do we fix that when it comes to populations, those two populations in particular?
When I took 2 forays into running for a political office, which was a very unusual thing for me to do. One was challenging Martin Sable, who was a 28-year incumbent, and that ended up creating space for Keith Ellison to be elected. And then running for Senate, it came down to whether Al Frankenreich would get the endorsement. And one of the things that I often did when I walked into a room, any room, in which there were people who were politically engaged and wanting to be part of a political process, was I would ask them about the things that they were most concerned about. And I would do a lot more listening than talking. And I think that I wish that the Democratic Party and Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota would do organized listening sessions, multiple ones in every county in the state, and not a session that was focused on the policies we're bringing to them, but simply listening sessions to talk about. And I remember one of the places that I found a lot of common sense was that almost everybody is concerned about healthcare, and it should be one of those issues that bring people together across all kinds of boundaries. And I think we need to be looking for those and working hard on those. My idea of politics still, I'm never going to run for public office again, but my idea was always, I kind of wanted to see if political leaders, elected officials, could help create a movement of movements that crossed all kinds of boundaries, that brought workers from different sectors together, that brought people who were concerned about climate change together with people that were concerned about the quality of jobs and feeding their families, to people, to farmers that were concerned about the price of land and the price of their crops and their dependency on fewer and fewer companies that are buying the products that they produce. There's so many ways in which it's okay to have a principal concern that drives you as a person, as a human being, or one or two. That's just natural. But it's very, very damaging when we break into silos. And I think that any steps that we can take, listening to others and bringing groups of people together. And I think there's going to be many, many, many opportunities to do that in the context of some of the consequences that I've hinted at in what I said earlier. And it's going to be vital to do it for the reason that that quote that I gave from the Chicago Board of Trade guy, or whatever his title was, who said what he's really worried about is not that we don't have some suggestions as liberals or progressive Democrats or however we want to call ourselves, not because we don't have ideas for what to do, but because it's very likely that as things unravel, that those that are most responsible for the unraveling will be able to successfully blame others for those failings. At the same time, I think another issue, and it's not probably number one on people's minds, but I do really worry that we're sleepwalking into an authoritarian crisis. And as that edifice of authoritarianism gets built, it becomes more and more difficult to challenge, and easier for those that are responsible for the crises to magnify and manipulate those crises for their own purpose.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. So when I was first named ag chair, I'd never been a farmer before. So I talked to some folks and said, hey, can we have a listening session just so I can hear what farmers are talking about? And we had close to 300 farmers show up in Piers one day. And I'm telling this story for a reason, because I think that people who are into politics get surprised sometimes by people. And that's a sign that we should have been listening more before.
Right.
At one point, and this is a very red area, all the farmers are in a certain the farmers who were in the room with us were all from a certain political perspective, most of them were. And at one point, one of them got up, and I didn't say a word the whole time I was there. They just spoke. One of the farmers got up and said, you know what's most important to me is making sure that the people who work on my farms can have driver's licenses so they can pick their kids up at school or go to the hospital.
Mm.
And that whole room of conservatives applauded giving driver's licenses to undocumented workers, undocumented people.
Amazing. Yeah.
And it's one of those moments where you're like, if people would just listen to people, they would understand that they're as complicated as we are. They're as complex as we are, and as deserving of the respect of human dignity and the attention and the empathy that other folks do. Which raises another question for me too. It's hard to run for office quoting Camus. Because one of my favorite bits of Camus is the myth of Sisyphus, when he writes Sisyphus, and it's, of course you're pushing the rock up and you're not going to get anywhere, but you're still supposed to smile because it's the process that you're supposed to commit to. But the process of politics today doesn't reward nuance. Or, the old expression is if you're explaining, you aren't gaining. So how do we deal with that? With your insightful, thoughtful, well-researched analysis doesn't fit on a bumper sticker.
Right.
So what are we going to do?
Yeah. No, I think the Republicans have far outpaced Democrats in messaging. Again, those ads that I talked about, the Democrats are for they, them, Trump is for you. Running and attacking trans people, creating all kinds of conflict over that. I think I read something that was responsible for shifting the votes of about 2.9% of voters, something like that in the national election. So yeah, how we frame things. That's why I agree with you, and I think it would be impossible to do my suggestion of 2 + 2 = 4 based on Camus, but maybe it's possible to do it just based on. I remember something that my students did at the University of St. Thomas years ago, is they made buttons, handmade these buttons, and the buttons had the figure of how much money the U.S. military was spending every minute. And all it said was the number.
Yeah.
And then everywhere that you went wearing that button, people asked, well, what does that mean? And it became an opportunity to talk about things that matter, especially in the midst of the Iraq wars and Afghanistan wars and other things. So I think something like 2 + 2 = 4. You don't want to have to get into a long conversation about Camus, but it might be a way of just saying, let's cut the bullshit. 2 + 2 = 4. And the reason I think, this is my judgment of the Republican Party, which is really not a Republican Party anymore, it's the party of Trump, is that I think, and this is why we're streaming or screaming our ways to authoritarianism, is there has probably been dozens and dozens and dozens of breakpoints that could have prevented getting us to where we are now. And at every turn, enough Republicans played along and went along and went along and went along. And usually it was calculating in some way that somehow they could make this work for them and for their party, which I guess was validated in this recent election for many. But at the same time, I think now most of those Republicans have crossed a line. And the line is, it's not just that they were calculating whether there was a consequence to saying 2 + 2 = 4, because they were so terrified of Trump. I think it's almost, Camus was saying, yeah, you got that, but there is a point at which you reach, which morally and ethically and practically is impossible to retreat from. Mm-hmm. And so you no longer really are even willing to say that 2 + 2 = 4. That the obvious is true, that facts are actually true. So there's something about that 2 + 2 = 4 simplicity that I like. I spend about 2 hours in the middle of the night just kind of thinking about that. And so I had to throw it in today to see if anybody thought that might work. But you're absolutely right about we can't be doing something like that based on a long conversation about Camus.
No, I absolutely love that. The 2 + 2 + 4 is, I think, fantastic. Especially because, but the strange thing to me about that too is that we could say that to a Trump follower, someone who in the question and answer period used the word cult. You could say that to a Trump follower, and I can imagine someone with all the evidence of math in the world saying, "Yeah, but it doesn't feel like that to me."
Yeah,
because that aesthetic has overtaken our capacity to deal with facts. And sure, you believe that, that's fine, but I feel like this is true, and that's good enough. So what I really like about what you said, and what I'm going to steal, should I ever run for office again, I'm going to steal this news if you don't mind, is the cut the bullshit part. I think when you put that on there first, cut the bullshit, 2 + 2 = 4. That sounds like a fantastic slogan for running for election. And given the coarseness of our current political vocabulary, you could probably get away with it too.
And I very much dislike. I'm a relatively. I'm a person that doesn't like to have lots and lots of things and need to buy new things all the time. And I'm aware of my consumptive patterns and how they impact the environment. I'm concerned about that stuff. So on the one hand, I wouldn't want to do this. On the other hand, I kind of think, boy, wouldn't it be nice just to have buttons that said 2 + 2 = 4, hats that said 2 + 2 = 4, and T-shirts that said 2 + 2 = 4. And if you did that and you were part of a national effort that you wore those in times of urgency, if you're having serious brutal crackdowns on people who are being deported, you show up, 2 + 2 = 4. When you hear the confirmation of Pete's exit, we should all be doing something. Anyway, so the mega brand, it has been unbelievably successful. And I'd like to counter it. And I almost think something like 2 + 2 = 4 is maybe a way to counter it if it were in an organized way, that it just became a uniting symbol of people saying, cut the bullshit, as you were saying, cut the bullshit, because we've just been fed a lot of it right now. And there is going to be so much bullshit flying over the next 4 years. It's going to be a real challenge. And some people maybe have heard me speak in other contexts, but I'll say it in this context too, that one of my life challenges and one of my commitments in these coming 4 years, is I refuse to let the MAGA movement take over my head and kill my joy. I refuse to let Donald Trump live in my head 24/7. And I refuse to be driven only by, believe it or not, I laid out a lot of negative things today, but that's why I want to balance a hard-headed cut the bullshit with also a challenge to lift up a vision of the people that we want to be and can be, and listening to each other. Because I believe that actually on a lot of issues, the majority of Republicans and Democrats are actually much closer together than the billionaires are with the mega base. Light years closer. But we have to figure out ways of building those relationships across boundaries and do it joyfully. I do believe doing it. That doesn't mean I'm not a serious guy. It doesn't mean that I don't get discouraged, but it means overall, I think humor, laughter, joy, vision, positive ideas, taking steps, practical step taking, all those things are really vital. And they're the way to maintain hope. Much more so than sitting on the sidelines.
I love that. I think that sounds great. And I especially appreciate that you're not advocating for a cult against the cult.
No.
We don't create the alternative. It reminds me of a great old Zen story of a samurai whose shogun is murdered, and then the samurai tracks down the guy who murdered his leader. And right as he's about to enact his vengeance, the guy spits in his face. And so he leaves them and comes back the next day, and then he kills them. But he couldn't kill him in anger, because then he would have become just as bad as the person who had, affronted him by killing his shogun. He had to come back when he was calm and do it again, because you can't. 2 wrongs don't make a right, but 2 + 2 makes 4. So I like that a lot. Terry, we're at almost 8:30. Are we supposed to keep going? I just want to check in.
Actually, we should tie it up. Do you want to talk for a minute about specifics about what people can do in this time? You've been talking generally.
Well, again, I would just say we don't know. We don't know all that's going to unfold. Camus was right about that in his time. We're right about that time. What we do know is that there's going to be a lot of people hurting. And I think it's our responsibility. And we're all gonna be hurt. I'm not distancing my own life from the consequences of climate change and other things. But I think to be particularly willing and mindful of where the pain is being felt, and trying to find ways of being helpful, of being supportive, of protecting. So I think that's one thing. Another thing, and I know that this is a general thing, but I think we need to counter each policy that proves itself to be disastrous or problematic, that we need to counter that with practical ideas for policies that we can be embracing. And this is where, again, I think a lot of that is going to need to happen at the state level, even though we can't dump everything on the state. The ground is going to shift in terms of what can actually be accomplished. So I think that's a really important thing to do. And then I think the other is that as the machine, the idea machine, continues in the full motion out of the White House orbit, we just need to be creating counter narratives that again cut through bullshit and name practical possibilities for moving forward. And the last thing I'll say is I know that one of the original hopes of a meeting like this was to maybe reach some of the people in Tom Emmer's district. But I'll bring it back to one of my lines and what I shared today that I think is really important. In a divided government federally that we have, but is under control, where you have the Supreme Court, you have the House, you have the Senate, and you have the presidency, and now you have the creation of a new department. That all of those things are working now. It can work to kind of ramshod things through. But what I pointed out is it's a very, very small majority. And that means that we need to really be giving a constant earful to Republicans about what the stakes are and reminding them, those of us who live who are constituencies of people in Republican controlled districts, we need to put as much, exercise as much leverage on them as possible. Because seriously, I can't imagine that there's more than a handful of people in the Republican Party in the House or the Senate that actually believe Donald Trump is a good human being and good president. I think it's a really small number. And all of them have made accommodations based on their own calculations of political interest, probably, and a fear of being ousted and all those things. But they're human beings, and we need to be working on them, because if you can flip a handful, we can prevent a lot of damage. So political engagement, very, very targeted, for me becomes a priority as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Aric, do you have any last words on what you would recommend?
No, I mean, Jack nailed everything, I think, through the whole evening. But I would just say briefly that when you're being attacked by division, coming together is its own counter argument. And realizing that when we do so with humility, practicality, and organization, and we do it now. That's the other thing. People, I think, too often think that politics is just about a day in November, and it's not. It's about every day that you wake up on the right side of the dirt. That's a day you're being political, and it's an opportunity for you to make the world better. So to the extent that we can organize now, and get sort of formal structures together, it creates greater opportunities for informal conversations. I think one of the things that Democrats do incredibly poorly is we think about just getting votes and not getting relationships that translate into multiple votes. So there are lots of people I talk to all the time. I have to in St. Cloud, talk to lots of Republicans and people who aren't going to vote for me. But I know that when I talk to them with care, they're going to tell their friends that Aric guy's not that bad of a guy. I'm still not going to vote for him, but he's not evil. And that's a win in the world we're in right now. Right. So I think some humility with our expectations, some care for each other, I think we're going to be all right.
Okay, this is a lot to take in tonight. Thank you both, Jack. That was tremendous amount of research. I look forward to seeing the transcript. And to our audience, we are going to send out a video of the talk tonight, so you'll have a chance to listen to it or share it with friends. Thank you again, both, and thanks to Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers for supporting this and getting the word out. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Katya, and our Zoom person, Katya Dow, from Citizens for Global Solutions.
Yeah,
thank you for all your work on setting this up. Thank you.
Thanks for all the people who participated that I can't see your names or faces, but I really, really appreciate that you were part of this. Thank you.
Yeah, most people stayed with it. Thank you. Thanks.
All right.
Good night.